Lee, I'll start with you, Ms. Yantel. Can you talk about the type of junk fees that renters are faced with? I don't think people are always, who don't rent anymore, maybe rented at some point, are not familiar with what's going on.
There can be thank you, Senator Klobuchar, there can be a whole host of fees added onto a renter's rent payment each month, ranging from first rental application fees to get into the apartment in the first place, and then fees related to late payments. Notices of late payments can have an extra fee. There's pet fees, there's fees for using a garage, or fees for an internet usage that's mandatory and somebody can't opt out of. There's been stories of these fees adding up to as much as $400 a month in addition to the rental payment, and sometimes they can be very egregious. We have a partner in Idaho who worked with a tenant whose son brought home from school one day a praying mantis in a jar, and that month they were charged a pet fee from the landlord. The good news was that spurred a successful campaign for the state of Idaho now to have a law that requires full transparency up front about any fees that might be paid, and requires that they be made reasonable. But they really can be egregious, and they certainly add up.
Wow. Just remembering back, my mom was a second grade teacher, and sometimes these type of animals would get lost when they went home. They were usually found, like the rabbits and things. But anyway, that's incredible. But I do think it gives us a sense of that, and those of us who rent when we're here actually know some of this as well. Professor Stuckey, just to go through this again, because I think it's a hard thing to get a grasp on. There have been numerous reports and lawsuits highlighting these price-setting tools that collect the pricing data, and as you rightly point out, there's no federal privacy law in place, which is a problem, to coordinate price increases among competing landlords. So they're able to get this data. And could you explain how these pricing tools could facilitate these higher prices? So they get the data and then it's shared, and how can that lead to these higher prices where you could see it as not a traditional way of fixing prices maybe, but a way of doing it in the modern digital age?
Okay, so I mean, there's several scenarios. One scenario is where every firm has their own pricing algorithm. So when you go to like Martha's Vineyard, one thing you're surprised by is the high price of gas. But what one study found is that when gasoline stations start having these pricing algorithms, the speed and the response can prevent any company from getting an advantage by discounting. So what happens then in these markets is that prices start then elevating up. So algorithms can help facilitate collusion in markets already susceptible to it, but it can also increase it. Another scenario, and this happened in Las Vegas, is where allegedly 90% of the hotels are all using one hub. And so no competitor is going to give commercially sensitive information to the hub if the hub can then use it to help the rivals. So there must be some understanding that they're going to share on a real-time basis commercially sensitive information with the hub so that it's going to benefit all of them.
Okay, so you rightfully noted some of the bills, some of them are my bills, that you could do generically to fix the antitrust laws, tweaks, things you could do, because it's very hard to bring any cases, including in tech and other things right now, where we've had no specific laws really passed except for Senator Lee's, which I'm the proud co-sponsor, bill on not changing venues, and then our bill to change the merger fees that Grassley and I had to get more money to the agencies. Could you talk specifically what you could do about this specifically to update our competition laws so that these tools, as they are called, or price-setting tools, as they can be used for, cannot be used to raise rent above what would occur in a competitive marketplace?
Right. I mean, I think there are several things that can be done. Number one is to restore the incipiency standard in antitrust, that courts are adrift. They used to interpret the antitrust laws with the aim that Congress had intended, right? Seller-Kefauver in 1950 enacted these amendments to the antitrust laws, and the Supreme Court construed the law as Congress intended. That's no longer the case. So one way would be to restore the incipiency standard, which your bill does. The second thing then would be a different standard than the rule of reason for information exchanges, just because the rule of reason is just amorphous and unwieldy. And then the third thing, and I think this is what like John Stuart Mill said, what one of the good things that the government can do is collect a lot of information and then disseminate it. So one nice thing about your bill is improving the knowledge that we have about what antitrust policies work and not work. I mean, when I was at the DOJ, it was always surprising that we would allow these mergers to happen, and then we never followed up to see,
Years later.
to see if it was right. And so,
Ticketmaster, Live Nation. Anyway, and I'm sorry, my mind just went to something else.
But-
Keep going.
but I would think that's one of the most important aspects that we can have. And then we could learn more about what markets are susceptible to tacit collusion. Is there a specific threshold? Like one study found, once it went beyond 8 sellers, the use of pricing algorithms became quite vigorous. And so we just need to have a better understanding, and the United States can play an important role in that.
One of the most pressing issues is not enough affordable homes. We just talked about that, single-family starter homes alike. Mr. Quintero, Dr. Quintero, could you explain how having fewer home builders in a market reduces the supply of new homes?
Thanks for the question, Chair Klobuchar. The underlying concern about competition in general is how fewer suppliers of any good or service are just going to supply less of it, and as a consequence, with a fixed demand, or in this case for housing with a growing demand, prices would go up. This is what has been happening in housing. We have fewer and fewer developers building, and it's in their own interest to charge higher prices. And that is not a new story. That's an old story. That's a story of housing markets. The problem is that as prices have gone up since 2011, we have not seen an entry of new developers that compete with those that are incumbent. And so what we find is that those that have an interest in supplying less to charge higher prices are not being threatened by competitors in many of the local markets.
And so do you think that's something antitrust enforcers should look at in the future when mergers are presented to them?
Yes, there's been at least 12 mergers that, if you look at the housing markets well-defined spatially, should have been challenged by any regulatory agency. They would have been challenged in other sectors. My belief and my understanding is that what they're doing is they're defining, in some cases, whole regions of the United States. In one case that I could find, the whole U.S. as a single housing market. I think that is wrong. We, as
they should talk to the people in Jackson County.
Right.
Minnesota.
As potential homeowners, we're not substituting between the possibility of living in D.C. and living in L.A., right? So yeah.
So that was that last comment, then I'll turn it over to Senator Hirono, or Senator Lee for additional question, then Senator Hirono for a second round. But one of the things that has been troubling to me is in some of our rural areas where we have very steady employers. We really do. And whether it's the ag economy or whether it's a manufacturing, we have a lot of major companies. There's still issues with this housing, and there's just not enough builders, and the land is not as expensive. We don't have the land issue that Senator Lee was referring to in our state. And I can't help but think that in the old days there were just more smaller people that were coming in the home building industry, because we just can't get, I've done everything, and we've looked at what incentives can we have to bid them. These are usually they're a mix of housing, right? They're starter homes. Some of them are traditionally affordable. Some are that next step up. And it's really hard, and it's hurting our rural employers because it's like chicken and egg. They want to expand. These are like manufacturing, but they can't really expand because they don't have the housing. And some of it is getting seniors to move into town, but then you need the condos. If they build them, they'll come, and then that frees up the single family. So thank you, Senator Lee.